Well, hello, friends, and thank you for joining with me again as we continue our journey through the book of Proverbs, taking a verse or two at a time and really trying to break them down, to unpack them so that we can understand how to take those points of wisdom and apply them to our own daily life. I don't know if you noticed or not, but last week's devotionals were pre-recorded, and the reason was because my wife and I were in London for a week, and we went there for a very specific purpose. I'm not a big fan of London. You know, some people like to go to the castles and see the crown jewels and those sorts of things. I'm not really a royal-phile. In fact, I kind of don't really think much of them. Really, I think they're for the most part an extremely unimpressive and unique group of people. But that's my own opinion. But I'm not an anti-royal. I just have a hard time with that. But that's my hang-up. Don't let me bother to put that on you. But what I did go for was not to see the culture of London, but rather to primarily visit the British Museum, which is the one of the largest museums in the world. It's most important because it has over 8 million different articles that they have there. Not all of them are on display. They only have about 800,000, about a tenth of them that are actually on display. But what's really notable about it is that 300,000 of the things that they have on display have direct relationship or connection to the Bible and the biblical history, some of them quite significantly. And it's really kind of an amazing thing when you begin to realize that here we have strong external evidence of the historicity of the Bible, that there are something like 80 different persons who are identified by literally their names chiseled on stone that are also connected to the biblical personalities. And we see this, throughout the museum. It's really interesting because the connections are really pretty strong and undeniable. So that people who like to say, well, the Bible, it doesn't really reflect an accurate historical account. Anybody that says that today really is hugely uninformed, and they're probably just repeating something that somebody said to them, because in fact we know that the historical accuracy of the Bible and the things it gives account with, especially when we talk not just on the Old Testament, but also the New Testament, is so firmly grounded that literally the archaeologists since the very beginning have used the Bible as a guide to tell them where they could find the things that other people were saying didn't exist or were part of mythology. And I could go through a long list of different things that once were considered just to be myths from the past, that now we know that we've uncovered the temples and the palaces and the scrolls and the documents and all these things that were directly correlated to the biblical events. So I went there for that purpose. I've read about them in the books, I've studied it, but I really have always yearned to really go there and look at it myself, and also to spend some time really rediscovering the Christian heritage that is so firmly grounded and founded in the Great Britain. The history of it going back to people like even Tyndale. One of the very first martyrs was martyred. Saint Albans was martyred in 300 A.D. by the Romans, and so the history of Christianity in Great Britain is long and deep, and it's really one of the keys to what we understand is the outreach to the world, because most of the modern missionaries, speaking of from the 1700s on, came from Britain and traveled around the world and made a huge difference and gave Christianity not only its presence, but also the scriptures themselves. So we're talking about, we're kind of strategizing now how to create kind of these Christian heritage tours to London. And I think it's something that we'll keep you posted on, because it was very, very edifying for me. My wife and I spent about 3 days going through the British Museum, and it's huge, and it has a lot of stuff. In fact, the t-shirt that I'm wearing today is one of the things I picked up there. What is this t-shirt of? Well, this is called the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone was a stone that was found by archaeologists that went with Napoleon when he sought to take control of the Suez Canal and thereby break the British's hold on trade with India and other places. And so what they did is they found this stone, and on this stone was written by Ptolemy V, who was one of the Greek pharaohs from about 200 AD, 200 BC. And on it, he had there was a kind of a coronation declaration, because he was actually just a child when he became the Pharaoh. But it was a coronation declaration, and they put it in 3 languages. The top language was in hieroglyphics. Now, keep in mind, in 1799, nobody knew how to read hieroglyphics. And so that was a real mystery that was kind of like a language that was unknown. And so we couldn't read a lot of the texts that were in many of the temples. And below that, it was another set of scripts which copying the hieroglyphic text, which was written in what's called Demetic, which is a kind of a common everyday language of the Egyptian people at that time, who no longer used hieroglyphics to write and to communicate. That was kind of the priestly language. And then last of all, it was in Greek, because the Ptolemaic kings, who reigned over Egypt for about 275 years after the time of Napoleon, after the time of Alexander the Great, up until the time of the Romans taking control of it. But it's really interesting, because it was written Greek and we know how to read the Greek, we were able to basically backward translate, not only knowing a lot about the Demetic, but also beginning to make the correlation. A Frenchman by the name of Champollion did the work of rendering it. Basically took him, and it was about until 1822 or 29, something like that, when he finally was able to really translate and figure out what all those symbols meant. And that opened the door to Egyptology today, where you have people traveling around different parts of Egypt and going to different temples and reading what's written on the walls in this hieroglyphic form, this pictographic language. And so it's given us a great deal of insight. So this t-shirt basically commemorates that. I had one that I bought years ago when I briefly went through the museum, and I don't know what happened to it. I think it, like this one did, as soon as you wash it, it shrank quite a bit. So the one thing I would say is, if you buy a t-shirt at the British Museum, they don't use quality cotton. But nonetheless, I got the t-shirt and I'm pretty proud of it. So anyway, we're looking at the book of Proverbs, as I said again, and I've almost used up all of our time today. But we're in chapter 10, and we left off in verse 22, where Solomon talks about money. And something you may have noticed if you've read through the book of Proverbs recently is that Solomon talks a great deal about money. And it's an important thing, because he presents us really with, I think, a balanced look, because many times as Christians, we almost feel guilty if we prosper. It's almost like, somehow poverty is the highest form of spirituality. And there's some truth in that, because James said that those who are poor in this world become rich in faith towards God. In other words, you tend to lean upon the Lord and pray a lot more about things when you don't have resources to respond to issues that come into your life. But you see, even the rich find themselves facing problems like health issues or other cataclysmic events in their life that they don't have the resources to address. Even nations can get to the place where they don't have the resources to address their challenges and problems. And so in a reality, we find that ultimately God is going to put us all in a place where we realize that we are in poverty in relationship to the problems that we're trying to deal with. And that provokes a heart of prayer. It may start as a prayer of desperation, but it also can lead us into a deeper prayer of devotion and really ultimately surrender, where we come to the place where, God, I don't have anything else, the time, the money, or the energy. I'm out of resources to respond to this problem. And Lord, unless you show up, unless you intervene, unless you do something very divine and miraculous, then I will be overcome by my circumstances. And, sometimes God lets you become overcome by your circumstances, because he wants you to realize that even the most negative circumstances can be a means by which God opens up a new door and leads your life in a new direction. But if the idea that suddenly having money is evil or bad, and actually the idea that poverty is automatically spirituality, isn't really an accurate way of looking at it, because there are many people who are very poor and they're very greedy, very selfish, very carnal, and part of the reason that they're impoverished is because they've been led by their sensory desires rather than allowing themselves to be led by the Spirit of the Lord. So verse 22 reads simply this way. It says, "The blessing of the Lord brings wealth, and he adds no trouble to it." So we're about out of time, and I'm ready to bring it to a halt. But tomorrow we'll pick that up, and we'll go into really a more deep analysis. I hope a balanced analysis of how we as followers of Christ should look at money and wealth and poverty as well, that we might react to them in a godly way. God bless. I'll continue on tomorrow. Take care.